He stared at the menu, embarrassed, fingers tightening around a wrinkled dollar bill. What he didn't know was that the young barista watching him wasn't just serving lattes. She was the billionaire heiress of the company he couldn't afford to buy from. Before we dive in, take a second and tell me, where in the world are you watching from? Drop it in the comments below, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's story will blow your mind. The bell above the cafe door chimed, a delicate sound drowned almost instantly by the rush of espresso machines and voices pitched too loud with early ambition. Jack Raymond stepped inside, shoulders tight beneath his faded jacket, one hand resting lightly on the small backpack his daughter carried. Emma tugged at him with impatient delight, her braids swinging as she pointed toward the chalkboard menu above the counter. "Hot cocoa, Dad," she whispered, like it was a spell. Jack smiled faintly, the kind of smile that carried more love than joy. He patted his pockets once, then again, like the repetition might magically double what he already knew was there. A handful of coins clinked together, a crumpled dollar folded so many times the corners had frayed. He stared at the numbers written in swirly chalk, cappuccino, latte, mocha, all costing more than his little pile of change. Even the small drip coffee, the cheapest item, left him short by 50 cents. Emma hadn't noticed. She was busy pressing her nose against the glass display, eyes wide at muffins topped with sugar crystals that glimmered in the light. Jack's throat tightened. He thought of the gas bill, the rent reminder taped to their apartment door, the way his overtime hours had been cut last week. One hot cocoa shouldn't feel like an impossible mountain, but here it was. "Tell you what," he said softly, crouching down so he could look Emma in the eye, "let's grab a seat by the window first. We'll just enjoy the morning together." Emma tilted her head, puzzled for only a second before nodding happily. "Okay." They slid into a booth, its cushions cracked at the edges, the view filled with people rushing along the sidewalk outside. Inside the cafe, the air was alive with clicking laptop keys, business jargon tossed across tables, and the hiss of milk steaming into froth. Men in pressed suits adjusted their watches. Women in tailored coats spoke into earbuds, pacing near the door. Jack leaned back, hands clasped in his lap, feeling like a ghost in the middle of it all. Invisible. That was the word. He'd grown used to it on subway rides, in boardrooms he cleaned after hours, in grocery aisles where people reached over him without looking. He was the man mopping in the corner, the shadow no one remembered once they left the room. And yet here, with Emma beside him sketching stars into her notebook, he wished invisibility didn't sting so much. He wanted her to feel like she belonged, even if he didn't. At the counter, the barista glanced up from the espresso machine. Her name tag read Clara, the letters etched neatly into plastic. She couldn't have been more than 25, hair pulled back in a loose bun, sleeves rolled to her elbows. But it wasn't her youth Jack noticed. It was her stillness. She didn't just look past him the way others did. Her gaze lingered, curious, almost searching. Like she'd seen this scene before, a father sitting with empty hands, a child hoping for more than he could give. Clara's eyes softened before she returned to wiping the counter. Customers came and went, orders called out, names scribbled onto cups with careless speed, but her glance flicked back toward the booth every so often, quiet as a heartbeat. Jack never saw it. He was too busy making Emma laugh by folding his crumpled dollar into the shape of a tiny bird. Emma giggled, clutching the paper bird to her chest as though it were treasure. For her, the morning was bright enough. For Jack, the weight in his chest didn't lift. He pressed his palms against the table, steadying himself. He could do without coffee, without cocoa, without warmth in a cup. What he couldn't do without was the promise in his daughter's smile, that even in the shadow of bills and exhaustion, he could still give her moments that felt like light. Clara watched from behind the counter, one hand resting on the register, her expression unreadable. The apron she wore marked her as staff, just another barista in a downtown cafe, but behind that fabric and plastic name tag lay a secret worth billions. A secret Jack Raymond had no reason to suspect, not yet. All he knew was that his daughter's laughter echoed through the cafe like music, and for a moment he almost believed they belonged there. Steam curled up from the espresso machine in delicate ribbons, vanishing into the hum of conversation that filled the cafe. Clara wiped the portafilter with a cloth, her movements brisk, efficient, the kind she'd practiced for weeks until they looked natural. Most baristas she worked beside assumed she was just another young woman trying to pay off student loans or survive rent hikes. That was the point. No one suspected that beneath the plain apron tied at her waist, she was Clara Winslow, the sole heir to the sprawling Winslow Cafe empire, a brand whose name was etched in neon across skylines from New York to Tokyo. Her father had insisted, "If you want to run the company, you'll know it from the ground up, not from behind a desk, not from a spreadsheet, from a register." Clara had agreed, partly out of defiance, partly because she'd grown tired of being chauffeured between glass boardrooms and penthouse suites. But she hadn't expected the experiment to mean much more than caffeine and routine. Customers usually blurred together, rushed executives rattling off complex orders, tired parents juggling strollers, college kids camped out for free Wi-Fi. Humanity on autopilot. This morning was different. Clara adjusted the steam wand, her eyes drifting past the counter to the corner booth near the window. The man and the girl. She'd noticed them when they walked in, he with a jacket that had seen too many winters, she with a sketchbook clasped to her chest like treasure. The man hadn't ordered right away. He'd hovered near the menu board, fingers brushing the inside of his pocket, then gently steered the little girl to a seat instead. Clara knew that hesitation. She'd seen it before, back when her mother used to volunteer at shelters, back when Clara had watched families measure coins before deciding whether to eat or not. It was the same motion, the quiet concealment of lack, as though poverty itself was a shameful secret. She shouldn't care. She was here to learn operations, not stories. But her gaze lingered. The man, Jack, she later heard the girl call him, sat with his shoulders slightly bent, like the weight of his own body was too much to carry. Yet when he leaned toward the girl, his whole frame seemed to shift. Tired eyes softened. His smile, brief but genuine, lit up a face that had forgotten youth. He gave her his attention fully, no glances at a phone, no distraction. Even in exhaustion, he poured out presence. That caught Clara off guard. She'd grown up around men whose wallets were heavy, but whose eyes were always elsewhere. The little girl, Emma, laughed at something he said, showing him the crooked lines of her sketch. Clara felt something in her chest stir, sharp and unfamiliar. She'd promised herself not to get entangled. Customers came and went, and she was supposed to stay behind the counter, detached. But the quiet dignity in Jack's silence, the way he made the booth feel like sanctuary for his daughter, tugged at her. She turned back to the register as another customer rattled off an order for a double-shot caramel macchiato with oat milk. Clara punched the buttons, forced a smile, handed over change. Her body was there, but her mind remained at the corner booth. She wondered how long it had been since Jack had tasted something without measuring its price first. For years, coffee had been Clara's inheritance, a commodity wrapped in marketing slogans and profit margins. She'd sat in boardrooms debating flavor profiles, product rollouts, the color of holiday cups. It had always been business, clean and impersonal. But now, standing behind a counter with steam rising around her, she felt the edges of that world blur. Coffee wasn't just a product. It was an absence, a longing, a barrier for a father too proud to admit he couldn't cross it. Clara wiped down the counter again, though it didn't need cleaning. Her gaze flicked once more toward Jack and Emma. Something about them pulled her out of the routine she'd built to keep the world at arm's length. She wasn't just watching customers anymore. She was watching a story unfold, one she hadn't written, one she wasn't sure she was allowed to step into. For the first time since she'd tied on the apron, Clara felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Not because of business, not because of her father's challenge, but because in the middle of that noisy cafe, A man who couldn't afford coffee was giving his daughter more love than Clara had ever seen money buy. And something inside her whispered that this morning was not just another shift. It was the beginning of a story she wouldn't be able to walk away from. Emma perched on the edge of the chair, knees tucked beneath her as though the booth were her own little kingdom. She flipped open her sketchbook, the pages already cluttered with stars, lopsided cups, and stick figures smiling with wide circles for mouths. Her pencil scratched with quick, earnest strokes, tongue poking from the corner of her lips in concentration. Jack leaned back, watching her with quiet pride, but his eyes kept drifting toward the counter, where the smell of roasted beans and steamed milk pressed at the edges of his restraint. He tried not to think about the coins in his pocket, how they'd clinked like shame when he counted them earlier. From behind the counter, Clara noticed. The father's hands were folded tightly, as though holding back something heavier than hunger. The little girl was content with her sketches, but Clara knew what it meant to come into a cafe and order nothing. It wasn't a choice. It was surrender, a small bruise to dignity that most people in suits never even thought about. She wiped her hands on a towel, grabbed a ceramic cup, and poured steamed milk into chocolate, the swirl rising into a cloud of sweetness. When she approached their table, Jack straightened, his brows pinched together, already forming a protest he hadn't spoken yet. Clara set the cup down gently, steam curling between them like a secret. "On the house," she said, her voice low, even, almost playful. "We made too much." Jack stared at the drink. It was a lie, obvious, but not the kind meant to wound, a kind lie, wrapped in the fragile gift of dignity. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. Emma gasped softly, her eyes lighting up as though the cocoa were a miracle. She reached for the cup with both hands, small fingers wrapping carefully around the warm ceramic. "Thank you, miss," she whispered, her voice barely louder than the steam. Clara's smile deepened. "Enjoy, sweetheart." Jack swallowed hard, his pride warring with relief. He hated accepting anything he couldn't repay, but Emma's joy was untouchable. To take the cocoa away from her now would feel like stealing sunlight. So he forced himself to nod, to let the kindness land, even as a promise curled inside him like a knot. Somehow, someday, he would repay this. Emma lifted the cup to her lips, sipping carefully. A smudge of chocolate clung to her upper lip, and she giggled, setting the cup down to wipe it with the back of her hand. Jack chuckled softly, the sound rare enough that Clara felt it like music. She lingered for a heartbeat too long before turning back to the counter. Her chest felt strange, full in a way it hadn't in years. She'd given away drinks before, brushed off the cost of a pastry to a tired student, slipped an extra shot of espresso into a regular's cup. But this wasn't the same. This wasn't charity, it was connection, the kind you didn't buy, didn't even ask for. It simply appeared like a note played in perfect pitch when the room had been silent too long. From across the cafe, Clara stole another glance. The girl sipped her cocoa with reverence, as though each mouthful was a secret worth savoring. Jack leaned close, asking her something, and Emma giggled again, drawing a little star above her cup in her notebook. Clara felt something twist in her chest. It wasn't envy, not exactly, but a hollow ache, the realization that in all her wealth and privilege she had never known what it was to be so simply, purely seen by someone. For Emma, that cocoa wasn't just a drink. It was proof that the world still noticed her, that kindness could slip through cracks no money had yet sealed. And for Clara, watching her sip with delight, it felt like witnessing a family she'd been missing all her life, a warmth she couldn't buy, only stumble upon when she dared to look closely. She turned back to the machine, wiping it down again, though it gleamed already. Her hands worked out of habit, but her thoughts stayed anchored to the corner booth, where a single cup of cocoa had built a bridge between strangers. And for the first time in her carefully constructed undercover life, Clara wondered if maybe this was the real reason she'd tied on the apron in the first place. Not to learn business, to learn people, to learn herself. The cafe had begun its slow transformation. that soft lull between morning chaos and afternoon calm. The chatter had thinned, laptops still hummed, and the clatter of cups grew sporadic. Clara untied her apron, folding it into a neat square, and slid onto a stool near the wide window. The sunlight spilled across the sidewalk outside, catching fragments of city life, heels clicking, tires splashing through puddles, people clutching paper cups like talismans against exhaustion. She opened her small leather notebook, the one she carried everywhere, though no one on staff had ever seen her write in it. The pages were cluttered with fragments, overheard conversations, sketches of strangers' postures, lines of dialogue that read like half-formed poems. Today, however, her pen hesitated. She looked up toward the booth by the window where a father and daughter had sat not long ago. Now the seats were empty, crumbs on the table, the faint ring of cocoa at the bottom of a cup. Her pen touched the page. She wrote Emma, special cocoa, stars in sketchbook, said, "Thank you, miss," as if it mattered. Then another line, almost without thought, Jack, quiet dignity. Shoulders heavy, but hands gentle, pride louder than hunger. Clara paused, the words sitting on the page like confessions. She was used to cataloging people as curiosities, small glimpses into lives she'd never touch. But this felt different. This wasn't observation. It was attachment. Outside, the man and the girl were already leaving, hand in hand. Jack's gait was slow, his frame hunched slightly forward as if the city's weight leaned on him alone. Beside him, Emma skipped, humming a tune so light it seemed to pull her father forward like a kite string. Clara pressed her palm against the glass, watching the contrast, his heaviness, her buoyancy. Two notes played in the same song. He hated needing kindness. She could see it even from here, in the tight set of his jaw. But Emma glowed, as though the small gift of cocoa had been an entire sunrise poured into her hands. Clara's throat tightened unexpectedly. She'd spent weeks here, blending into the background of her own empire, convinced she could understand humanity through repetition. Drinks ordered, names scribbled, faces blurred. The cafe was supposed to be a stage, each day a new play with actors who entered and exited before she ever learned their names. But now, with Jack and Emma, she felt like she'd stumbled into a performance where the script mattered, where she wasn't just the audience, but part of the story. She sketched quickly in the margin of her notebook, a rough drawing of Emma's small hands wrapped around the cocoa cup, steam rising like music notes. Then she added Jack's profile, not perfectly, but enough to capture the lines of weariness carved into his face. She stared at it, the image haunting her more than it should. Her co-workers laughed in the back, tossing aprons onto hooks, trading jokes about tips and cranky customers. Clara closed the notebook and held it against her chest. She couldn't explain, not to them, not even to herself fully. It wasn't pity. She'd seen poverty before, glimpsed it through car windows and charity galas where her family wrote checks big enough to ease guilt but never touch reality. This was something else, something raw, unsettling. The father and daughter turned the corner, vanishing from sight. Clara kept staring at the empty sidewalk as though they might reappear if she wished hard enough. For the first time since she'd slipped into this undercover role, she didn't feel like she was conducting an experiment. She felt tangled, caught in the threads of a story she hadn't chosen but couldn't ignore. She exhaled, a slow breath fogging the glass, then whispered under it almost to herself, "Who are you, Jack Raymond?" No answer came, only the murmur of the espresso machine being cleaned for the next rush. Still, Clara knew something had shifted. This wasn't just another day, another customer. It was the beginning of something that refused to stay written in chalk on a menu board, something that demanded ink. The sound of water dripping was steady, almost taunting. Jack crouched under the kitchen sink with a wrench in hand, his knees pressed against linoleum worn soft by years of use. The pipe above him glistened with moisture, another stubborn leak he had patched 3 times before. He twisted the metal with careful force, lips pressed tight in concentration, as though the small repair was the only barrier between him and collapse. Behind him, Emma sprawled on the living room floor with a box of broken crayons. The light bulb overhead flickered faintly, but she didn't notice. She was humming a little tune, cheerful and off-key, drawing pictures of stick-figure girls holding cups nearly as big as their heads. Across the page she wrote in shaky 7-year-old letters, "Coffee Angel." Jack let out a tired laugh, muffled by the cabinet door. He wanted to tell her angels didn't come with aprons and cocoa, but the way she said it, so certain, made him hold the words back. The world didn't give out angels. It handed you bills, overdue notices, and leaky pipes. But Emma's eyes made room for a softer truth, and he couldn't bear to steal it from her. When he finished tightening the pipe, he wiped his hands on an old towel and leaned against the counter. The fridge groaned behind him, its shelves holding little more than half a carton of milk, a few apples starting to wrinkle, and a jar of peanut butter scraped thin. He glanced at it, the quiet weight of responsibility pressing into his chest, then turned back to Emma. "You ready for bed, kiddo?" he asked. She shook her head, still coloring. "One more page. I'm making her wings this time." "Wings?" "The coffee angel. She needs wings to fly." Jack crouched beside her, resting a calloused hand on her shoulder. "She doesn't need wings, sweetheart." "You already gave her one. Your smile." Emma giggled, leaning into him. "You're silly, Dad." Later, after she'd brushed her teeth and changed into pajamas, he tucked her under the thin quilt on her bed. The paint on the wall above her headboard peeled in small curls, and the window frame rattled faintly with every gust of wind outside. Jack smoothed her hair back, his thumb brushing her temple. "Tell me about Mom," Emma whispered, eyes wide with the familiar request. Jack swallowed. He had told this story 100 times, and still it made his chest ache. "She had a laugh like bells," he said softly, "the kind that made people turn their heads just to hear it again. And she loved music. Every song I wrote, she said it sounded better when I played it for her." Emma's eyelids grew heavy. "Will things get better, Daddy?" Jack pressed a kiss to her forehead. "They will," he said, the words steadier than he felt. "Better days are waiting. We just have to keep walking until we find them." She drifted off with a smile, clutching her stuffed rabbit, like it held the promise itself. Jack lingered, watching her chest rise and fall, before stepping quietly into the small living room. He pulled an old leather-bound notebook from the shelf, its edges worn and pages yellowed. When he opened it, bars of music and fragments of lyrics stared back, reminders of a man he used to be. His fingers traced the notes as though they might sing again if he pressed hard enough. But the guitar was long sold, the dream tucked away beneath shifts and rent notices. He closed the book, his hands trembling with the memory of melodies buried under survival. Across the city, Clara slipped out of her penthouse elevator and into a world of marble floors and glass walls. She hung her apron on the back of a chair, staring at it as though it belonged to someone else. The silence in the apartment was vast, filled only with the hum of the city below. She poured herself a glass of water and caught her reflection in the window. Perfect hair, perfect clothes, every inch polished into an image of control. And yet her mind replayed the man at the cafe. Jack, shoulders bent but eyes full of love. His daughter, beaming over a simple cup of cocoa as though it were gold. Clara set the glass down too hard, water spilling onto the counter. She pressed both palms against the cool surface, her throat tight. She had everything, wealth, power, security. Yet tonight she felt hollow. The man with nothing had looked richer in love than she had ever been. And for the first time Clara wondered if all her fortune had only bought her walls, while a janitor and his daughter had found something she could never name. The morning air was brisk, sharp enough to sting Jack's cheeks as he tightened Emma's scarf around her neck. He'd thought about taking another route to school, avoiding the cafe entirely. Last night he had lain awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying the moment Clara had set that cocoa down on the table. It had felt like a kindness he couldn't afford to receive twice. But Emma had begged, her little voice stubborn in the way only children's hearts can be. "Please, Daddy, just one more time. Maybe the coffee angel will be there." So here they were, stepping back through the glass doors into the swirl of roasted beans, chatter, and clinking porcelain. Jack kept his head low, already rehearsing an apology if someone thought they were taking advantage. He hated the thought of seeming like a man chasing free handouts, but Emma's hand in his gave him no choice. She practically skipped across the tile, eyes bright with memory. Behind the counter, Clara looked up the moment the bell chimed. She saw them before she could stop herself, and her chest tightened in a way she couldn't name. Relief, anticipation, something warmer than either. She'd told herself not to expect them back. People like Jack, men carrying invisible weights, didn't linger where they felt out of place. And yet here he was again, shoulders hunched against the world, but still here. And Emma, all light and sparkle, pulling him along as though joy was enough to pay the tab. Jack cleared his throat at the counter, sliding a few coins and a single crumpled bill across the surface. "Small black coffee," he said quietly, his voice steady but his eyes fixed downward. Clara nodded, her fingers brushing the change, but her gaze flicked past him toward Emma, who was already craning to see what pastries sat behind the glass case. Clara poured the coffee, poured something else too, a decision she didn't even hesitate over. She reached for a small paper bag, slipped in a muffin, then set the cup and bag on the counter. "Coffee," she said simply. Then, with the kind of casualness born of practice, she added, "and an extra muffin." "They gave me too many this morning." Jack looked up, suspicion flickering across his face. He knew the lie when he heard it. His first instinct was to push it back, to insist on paying, to guard what little pride he had left. But Emma's gasp came too quickly, her eyes wide, as though someone had handed her Christmas morning wrapped in brown paper. "For us?" she whispered. Clara smiled, leaning down just a little so the words landed only on Emma. "For you." Emma hugged the bag like treasure, her grin so wide it nearly split her face. Jack's resistance cracked under the weight of that smile. He let out a slow breath, nodded once to Clara, then picked up the coffee. "Thank you," he said, his voice low, rougher than he meant. As they carried their things to a corner table, Clara felt her pulse quicken. She had given away drinks before, muffins too, but this was different. It wasn't about cost or inventory. It was about noticing. She had seen the way Jack's hands trembled when he pulled out coins, how he pressed his lips together to keep disappointment from spilling. She had seen the way Emma's eyes lit at the smallest gesture. And she knew, with a clarity that startled her, that this family of two mattered to her more than all the nameless customers she'd served. Jack took a sip of his coffee, bitter and hot. He sat across from Emma, who had already torn the muffin in half and was humming happily, offering him a piece without hesitation. His chest ached at her generosity, at how she never hoarded joy. He glanced toward the counter, toward the young barista with the steady eyes, and something unsettled stirred in him. This wasn't just kindness, she noticed. She noticed too much. That was what made it dangerous. Hunger was familiar. He could outlast it, swallow it down. But hope was something else. Hope made promises the world rarely kept. And if this girl behind the counter kept looking at him like she saw more than a janitor with a threadbare wallet, he wasn't sure which would break first, his pride or the fragile armor he'd built around his heart. Clara turned away, busying herself with another order, but her hands trembled slightly as she worked. For her, these moments were electric, sparks that lit corners of her life she hadn't realized were dark. She wasn't just handing over muffins or cocoa, she was stepping into something real. And for reasons she couldn't yet explain, she wanted to keep stepping closer. Clara moved slowly between the tables, a damp cloth in one hand, the other steadying a tray of empty mugs. She wasn't in any rush. The morning rush had passed, leaving the cafe quieter. Sunlight stretched wide across the wood floors. Most customers had sunk into their laptops, headphones in insulated in their private worlds. The only voices belonged to a father and his daughter at the corner table. Clara's eyes kept drifting there no matter how many cups she cleared. Emma sat cross-legged on the bench, her sketchbook open, pencil darting across the page in quick, excited lines. Jack sipped his coffee, shoulders slightly hunched, gaze distant, as though the weight of the week pressed against his chest even here. Clara lingered by the table next to theirs, wiping down a surface that was already clean. Finally she spoke, her voice soft enough to be casual, but just loud enough to bridge the space between them. "She's an artist," Clara said, nodding toward the sketchbook. Jack looked up, eyes narrowing with the instinctive caution of a man who wasn't used to strangers noticing. His fingers tightened slightly around the coffee cup, but then he glanced at Emma, who was too absorbed in her drawing to hear, and something in his expression softened. "She likes to draw," he said carefully. Clara stepped closer, curiosity winning over hesitation. "May I?" she asked, pointing toward the page. Emma looked up this time, shy but proud, and turned the book so Clara could see. A lopsided cup of hot cocoa sat in the middle of the page, steam curling like ribbons into a sky dotted with stars. Clara crouched down, smiling. "That's beautiful," she said with quiet sincerity. "You made the steam look like music." Emma's cheeks turned pink. Jack tilted his head, surprised at the observation. Most people dismissed Emma's drawings with polite praise, never really looking. Clara had looked. "She sees the world that way," Jack said, almost reluctantly, "like everything has a song." Clara met his gaze, something unspoken flickering there. "Maybe she's right," she murmured. Silence lingered, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Clara straightened, leaning against the edge of a chair, as though the conversation had made her forget her role as barista. She nodded at Jack's cup. "So do you like it bitter? Or did you just forget the sugar?" Jack raised a brow, the corner of his mouth twitching despite himself. "Bitter's fine," he said. "Keeps you awake?" "Or grumpy," Clara teased lightly. The remark slipped out before she could stop it. For a second she feared she'd crossed a line, but then, unexpectedly, Jack laughed. Not loudly, not freely, but enough. A short, rough sound that carried more life than he had shown in weeks. Emma's head shot up, eyes wide, and then she grinned so brightly it seemed her whole body lit up. "You laughed!" she exclaimed, delighted, as though she'd just witnessed magic. Jack shook his head, embarrassed, but Emma's joy was contagious. Clara felt it too. Something small had cracked open at the table, something she hadn't expected when she started wiping down a spotless surface. They talked a little longer, skimming across safe ground. Article, childhood memories, cocoa recipes. Jack revealed little about himself, words measured, careful, but Clara could sense it anyway, the heaviness behind his pauses, the way his gaze sometimes drifted as though pulled toward a memory he didn't dare name. She didn't push, she simply let the conversation flow where it wanted, holding space for what was said and for what wasn't. When another customer called for her at the counter, Clara excused herself, reluctantly breaking the fragile thread that had formed between them. She returned to her duties, but her mind stayed anchored at the corner table. Jack sat back, watching Emma giggle as she added more stars to her drawing. He sipped his coffee again, the bitterness now softened by something he couldn't quite define. A stranger had made him laugh, just once, and somehow that single moment felt more dangerous and more hopeful than anything else the day might bring. Clara felt it too, as she wiped down another counter with a hand that trembled just slightly. It was small, barely a spark, but she knew. It was the beginning. The city glowed beneath Clara's penthouse windows. All glass and steel lit up like constellations that had traded mystery for stock tickers and brand names. She dropped her keys onto the marble counter with a metallic clatter that echoed in the cavernous silence. The lights had been set low by the house system, soft gold spilling across furniture chosen by decorators rather than her. A plate sat waiting on the dining table, grilled salmon, steamed vegetables, a glass of wine. She'd told the staff she wasn't hungry, but they'd prepared it anyway, as if routine could fill what appetite no longer touched. She sat at the edge of the table staring at the plate, the steam fading into nothing. Hours ago she had been laughing, not much, not loud, but enough to surprise herself. A father with weary eyes had let his guard slip just long enough for a chuckle, and it had landed inside her like a spark in a dark room. That sound, rough and reluctant, had done something no gala speech, no boardroom victory, no glossy magazine feature had ever done. It had made her feel alive. Clara pushed the plate away, appetite abandoned. She walked barefoot across the polished floor, each step clicking against emptiness. The penthouse was too big for one person, every corner whispering its loneliness back at her. She stopped in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows and pressed her palms to the cool glass. Below, the city pulsed with life, people clinking glasses in dim bars, lovers holding hands, families gathering around tables. Connections, things she could observe from a distance but rarely touch. Her reflection looked back at her. Tailored blouse, perfect hair, posture straight as a blade. The image of a woman in control, heir to an empire of cafes that wrapped around the globe. She had wealth, influence, security, everything her father had groomed her to protect. But none of it had ever made her chest ache the way it had when Jack Raymond looked at his daughter as though she were the only star left in his night sky. She tried to reason with herself. It was curiosity, that was all. An interest in stories, in humanity she didn't often get to touch. That was the whole point of working undercover, to understand the customers who built their fortune one cup at a time. But the argument crumbled the longer she stared at her reflection. This wasn't research. This wasn't curiosity. It was him. The quiet strength in his silence, the weight he carried with a dignity that made her own complaints feel shallow, the way he gave his daughter his full attention, even when exhaustion shadowed his face. He had nothing, at least not by the world's terms, and yet, sitting in that booth, he had looked richer than anyone she had ever met. Clara let out a slow breath, pressing her forehead to the glass. For the first time, she admitted it. She was drawn to him, not just to the story he represented, but to the man himself. The realization rattled her. Because how could she, with her penthouse and her last name, step into his world without breaking it? What would it mean to bring her fortune, her headlines, her weight into a life that had already been scraped thin by struggle? A man like Jack didn't need charity dressed up as affection. He didn't need someone swooping down from marble floors to save him. He needed space to be the man he already was. Clara turned from the window and sank onto the edge of her bed, the city lights painting her in fractured gold. She felt the question press against her ribs, heavy and insistent. Was she capable of stepping toward him without taking something away? Her phone buzzed with a new email, another investor proposal, another gala invitation, another distraction meant to remind her of who she was supposed to be. She silenced it. None of it mattered, not compared to the sound of a single laugh that still echoed in her chest. She sat there, hands folded, heart unsteady, realizing that for the first time in her carefully constructed life, she wasn't thinking about empire or succession. She was thinking about a janitor with tired eyes, a daughter who drew stars, and the terrifying possibility that the life she had built might not be the one she wanted anymore. The letter came folded in half, slipped under the door with a soft scrape that woke Jack before dawn. He unfolded it at the kitchen counter, the words sharp even in the dim light. Due to budget restructuring, your hours will be reduced, effective immediately. Reduced. Such a simple word for such a brutal cut. He leaned against the counter, hand pressed to his forehead, the paper crumpling in his grip. Another hit. Another hole in a ship already taking on too much water. The apartment felt colder than usual, draft seeping through cracked windows. The fridge hummed, but inside it offered little, some eggs, a jar of mustard, half a loaf of bread. Jack pulled out the bread, forcing himself to eat a slice dry just to quiet the knot in his stomach. Across the hall, a neighbor's TV blared morning news, cheerful anchors talking about markets and growth. He let out a bitter laugh. Growth for who? Not for him. On the top shelf of his closet sat the guitar case, dusty but intact. He hadn't opened it in months, maybe longer. The thought had been creeping closer with every overdue bill, every reminder taped to the door. Pawn it. One sale, and it could cover rent or groceries or the electric. It was just wood and strings, after all. Memories couldn't pay the landlord. Jack pulled it down, set the case on the bed, and stared at it. His hands hovered over the latches, trembling. He didn't hear Emma at first, padding into the room in her socks, hair mussed from sleep. Her eyes widened when she saw the case. "Daddy, no," she whispered, her voice small but fierce. Jack froze. "Sweet pea, go back to bed." She shook her head, tears already brimming. "You can't." "Not the guitar." "Please, Daddy. You told me it was special. You told me it was Mommy's favorite." The words cut deeper than any bill ever could. He sat down heavily on the edge of the bed, the case still closed. Emma climbed beside him, clutching his arm. Her cheeks were wet, her whole body trembling with the urgency of keeping what little they had. Jack wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close. "I won't," he whispered into her hair. "I promise. I won't." But even as he said it, the lie burned in his throat, because he didn't know how much longer promises could hold back the flood. He pressed his lips to her forehead, hiding the desperation clawing at him. "We'll be okay," he murmured. She nodded against his chest, but he could feel how tightly she clung, like she didn't believe him either. When she finally drifted back to sleep, he sat in the dark living room, head in his hands. The guitar case leaned against the wall, a silent witness to his failure. He hated himself for even thinking of selling it, hated the helplessness that came with loving someone more than you could provide for them. The next day he dragged himself through what remained of his shift, the hours clipped short, his paycheck already gutted. By the time he picked Emma up from school, exhaustion hung heavy on his shoulders. She chattered about her drawings, her teachers, but he only half heard her, too lost in the math of survival. And yet, almost without deciding, he found himself steering toward the cafe. It wasn't logic, it wasn't habit, it was need. When they stepped inside, the familiar scent of coffee and the soft hum of chatter washed over him like warmth he didn't deserve. Emma darted to their usual spot, sketchbook already in hand, while Jack stood in line, coins clinking in his palm. Behind the counter, Clara looked up. Their eyes met, and for a moment the weight eased. She smiled, not the practiced smile she gave to strangers, but something gentler, quieter, like she was glad he had come back. Jack felt something flicker inside him, faint as light sneaking through a crack in boarded windows. He ordered his small black coffee, the same as always, but when Clara slid the cup across, her fingers brushed his, and the warmth lingered longer than the drink could. He carried it to the table, sat down across from Emma, and let himself breathe for the first time that day. Bills still waited. Hours were still cut. The guitar still sat on the edge of survival. But here, in this corner of a cafe, with his daughter humming over her sketches and Clara's presence weaving through the air like sunlight, he felt something he hadn't in weeks. A glimmer of peace, fragile but alive. Hope, dangerous as it was, had found a way in. The boardroom was a world away from the cafe. Polished mahogany table, leather chairs that sighed when men in dark suits leaned back, screens glowing with graphs and quarterly projections. Clara sat at the far end, her apron folded neatly in her bag, hidden like a secret she wasn't ready to confess. Her father sat at the head of the table, hands steepled, silver cufflinks flashing every time he gestured. The conversation had drifted from expansion plans in Asia to investor relations, but eventually, as it always seemed to lately, it circled back to her. "Clara," he said, his tone sharp as a gavel, "this charade needs to end." The others glanced at her, Some with polite curiosity, some with poorly concealed disdain. They all knew what he was talking about. She'd been working shifts behind the counter for nearly 2 months now, slipping into anonymity while they debated profit margins. "It's not a charade," Clara replied evenly. Her father leaned forward, voice low but carrying the weight of command. "You're the future of this company. You belong here, in this room, preparing for what's next, not brewing lattes for minimum wage." A few of the board members chuckled softly, though no one dared laugh outright. Clara kept her gaze steady. She thought of the cafe that morning. The way Emma's face had lit up over a muffin, the way Jack's hands had wrapped around a cup of bitter coffee as though it were a lifeline. "I'm learning," she said. "Learning?" her father scoffed. "We spend millions on consultants. We have reports stacked higher than that counter you're hiding behind. What could you possibly learn there that you can't learn here?" Clara wanted to tell him the truth, that numbers couldn't teach her the shape of weariness in a man's shoulders, the sound of hope cracking through laughter, the way a single cup of cocoa could turn a child's morning into a miracle. But she swallowed the words. If she spoke them aloud, she'd expose something fragile she wasn't ready to share. "I see things I wouldn't see here," she said instead. "I see what our cafes mean to people who don't care about stock prices. People who come in with nothing, just needing a seat, a drink, a moment to breathe." Her father's jaw tightened. "You can't save everyone who walks into a cafe, Clara." The words hung heavy in the air. She glanced down at her hands, folded neatly in her lap, then lifted her chin. "Maybe not everyone," she said softly, "but maybe one." Her father's eyes narrowed, studying her as though trying to find the weakness in her armor. "Sentiment doesn't build empires," he said finally. "Discipline does. Sacrifice does. Remember that." The meeting moved on, numbers and forecasts droning through the air, but Clara barely heard them. Her mind had already drifted back to the corner booth at the cafe, where a man with nothing still managed to give his daughter everything. She thought about the way Emma had called her a coffee angel, the way Jack's laughter, just once, had broken through his silence. The board could talk about margins all they wanted. She had seen something that no chart could measure. When the meeting finally ended, her father pulled her aside in the corridor. His voice was quieter now, not sharp, but heavy with disappointment. "You're my daughter," he said. "This company will be yours. But you need to decide whether you want to lead or play pretend. You can't do both." Clara met his gaze, steady as stone. "Maybe leading isn't what you think it is." He shook his head, turned, and walked away, his footsteps echoing against marble floors. Clara stood there, heart pounding, apron still tucked inside her bag. She should have felt shaken. Instead, she felt a strange calm, the kind that comes when a choice is already made. She knew she'd go back to the cafe tomorrow, tie on that apron, and face the quiet hum of lives unfolding. She didn't need to save the world, but if she could be there for one father, one daughter, maybe that was enough. The morning of Emma's birthday arrived with little fanfare. Jack had woken early, his body stiff from another restless night on a worn mattress, and set about crafting what he could manage. A single cupcake, vanilla, slightly lopsided, the frosting uneven from the cheap tub he'd found at the discount store. He pressed a candle into the center, bent slightly from being reused last year, and wrapped the cupcake carefully in a napkin as if it were treasure. He wanted Emma to feel like the day was hers, even if the world hadn't given him much to work with. Emma beamed when she saw it. "It's perfect," she whispered, clutching it with both hands like it was gold. Jack swallowed hard, kissing the top of her head. He told her they'd go to the cafe before school, make it their little party. She nodded eagerly, not needing balloons or gifts, just him, just the moment. That was both her gift and his wound. When they walked into the cafe, the air smelled of espresso and warm bread. The tables hummed with quiet chatter, strangers folded into their mornings. Jack guided Emma to their usual booth, sliding the cupcake onto the table. He tried to smile, but it carried the weight of a man who wanted to give his daughter the world and had only managed a handful of sugar and flour. From behind the counter, Clara noticed immediately the small candle, the cupcake, the way Jack's hands lingered over it as though apologizing for its simplicity. Emma's face glowed anyway, eyes shining with delight, and Clara felt something inside her chest tighten. She excused herself from the register, murmured to another barista to cover, and slipped into the back. She rummaged quickly through supplies, heart racing. There had been a small cake in the staff fridge, someone's leftover from a catering order, forgotten after a canceled pickup. She set it on the counter, its white frosting plain but intact, and found a few candles in the drawer meant for staff birthdays. Her hands shook as she arranged them. She didn't plan this, hadn't thought it through, but something told her she couldn't just watch from the sidelines today. Minutes later, the cafe lights dimmed, heads turned, murmurs rising in confusion. Clara emerged from the back, holding the cake carefully, candles flickering against her face. She began to sing softly, her voice low but carrying, a tune that spread through the room like warmth. Emma's eyes widened, her lips parting as tears welled. She looked from the cake to her father as though asking if this was real. Jack's throat closed, the sight blurring in his vision. He hadn't seen anyone do something like this for them in years, not since before Rachel, not since before life had shrunk down to survival. The song caught on. A few customers joined, some awkwardly, some with genuine smiles. The whole cafe seemed to hush into a single note, focused on the little girl with her sketchbook and the cupcake that was suddenly surrounded by more candles than she could count. Clara set the cake down gently in front of Emma. "Make a wish," she said, her smile trembling just slightly. Emma squeezed her eyes shut, whispered something no one could hear, and blew out the candles in one long breath. The room erupted in soft applause. She laughed, clapping her hands together, cheeks flushed pink with joy. Jack pressed his hand to his mouth, fighting the swell in his chest. He looked at Clara, unable to speak, gratitude tangled with disbelief. She stood there, suddenly self-conscious under the weight of his gaze. For a moment she felt exposed, as if everyone in the cafe could see through her, past the apron, past the facade, to the woman who cared more than she should. But then Emma leaned forward, hugging her tightly, her small arms fierce around Clara's waist. "Thank you," she whispered. And Clara knew she would carry that moment longer than any headline or boardroom victory. Jack cleared his throat, blinking back tears. He wasn't used to kindness. It unnerved him, made him feel vulnerable. But watching Emma laugh, watching her feel celebrated, he realized there was no space for pride here, just gratitude. For Clara, it wasn't charity. It wasn't even about Emma's birthday. It was about life breaking through routine, about choosing to step into someone else's story, and finding, to her surprise, that it made her feel alive. It was late morning when the cafe doors swung open and the familiar figure of Mr. Hawkins shuffled inside. He came in almost every day, a retired lawyer who still wore his suits, though the ties hung loose and the jackets had lost their crispness. He ordered the same thing without fail, a medium latte with extra foam, and always left a generous tip, as if trying to keep alive the habits of a life that once revolved around appearances. Clara had grown used to his routine, the way he leaned on the counter with that knowing look. People in his generation carried, as though they'd seen through everything already. But today his eyes narrowed as he studied her. She smiled politely, ready to ring up his order when he leaned closer. "You know," he said in a voice meant only for her, "you look an awful lot like that Winslow girl, the Heiress. Saw her picture in the paper last month." The air thinned around her. Clara forced a laugh, brushing a strand of hair back from her face. "I get that a lot." "Must just be the jawline," he chuckled, though his eyes lingered a little too long, suspicion or curiosity stirring. He left with his latte, muttering something about uncanny resemblances, and Clara turned back to the espresso machine, her hands moving quickly, as though speed could erase what he'd just said. Jack had been standing in line, Emma by his side, her sketchbook open against her knees. He caught the words, not all of them, but enough. The sound of her last name, the weight in Hawkins's tone. When he reached the counter, he slid his change forward and glanced at Clara. "So?" he said lightly. "You a celebrity I don't know about?" Her heart lurched. She forced herself to smile, the practiced kind that had worked in boardrooms and interviews, but now felt too fragile. "Hardly," she said. "Just a girl pouring coffee." Jack studied her for a beat, his expression unreadable. He wasn't the type to pry. She knew that about him already. But there was something in his gaze that unnerved her, as if he sensed a truth she was trying to bury under aprons and paper cups. Emma tugged at his sleeve, asking if she could sit at their booth, and Jack let the moment slip away. He carried the coffee to their corner table, but Clara could feel his curiosity like a thread still connecting them. As she wiped down the counter, her mind raced. It had been inevitable, she supposed. She'd lasted longer than she expected, blending in with the other baristas, letting herself fade into the background. But the Winslow name carried weight in this city, and she couldn't stay hidden forever. One slip, one whisper, and the walls she'd built between her two lives would come crashing down. She glanced toward the booth. Jack was leaning forward, listening, as Emma explained her drawing. His face was soft, tired, but lit with patience, and the sight of him made her chest ache. He didn't know who she really was. To him, she was just Clara, the barista who slipped muffins into bags and dimmed the lights for birthday wishes. If he learned the truth, if he saw the penthouse, the boardrooms, the empire, what then? She pressed her hand to the counter, grounding herself. She hadn't come here to deceive, not really. She'd come to learn, to strip away the layers of wealth and see what her company meant to the people who actually lived with it. But Jack complicated everything, because around him it wasn't just about understanding customers or business models. It was about feeling seen in a way she hadn't for years. And now the seams were fraying. His question still hung in the air between them, unanswered. Her lie, or half-truth, wouldn't hold forever. Clara turned back to the espresso machine, her reflection faint in the steel surface. The heiress looked back at her, no matter how hard she tried to play the barista. For the first time, the thought truly scared her. Her time undercover was running out. The notice came folded in half, bright red ink stamped across the top, like a wound that refused to close. Jack stared at it on the kitchen counter, the words swimming together, final warning, eviction pending. He rubbed the back of his neck, the skin raw from sleepless nights, his mind spinning through numbers that never added up. Rent was overdue again, more than he could make with his hours slashed in half. The envelope felt heavier than it should, as if it carried not just paper, but the slow collapse of the life he was trying to hold together for Emma. He crumpled the letter in his fist and shoved it into the trash. Emma was humming in the next room, coloring on the floor, her small voice bright, untouched by the storm brewing around them. He couldn't let her see, not yet, not while he could still shield her with stories and promises. That night he sat in the dark, the only light coming from the street lamp bleeding through the blinds. He thought of the guitar leaning against the wall, thought of the notebook filled with half-finished lyrics. None of it would keep a roof over their heads. He pressed his palms against his face, swallowing the thought that had been circling for weeks. Maybe he couldn't do this. Maybe love wasn't enough when the bills came knocking. The next morning he walked Emma to school, her hand small and warm in his. She asked if they could stop by the cafe, see the coffee angel Jack forced a smile, and shook his head. "Not today, sweetheart." Daddy's got work. His chest ached at the disappointment that flickered in her eyes, but he couldn't bring himself to walk through those doors. Not when shame hung around his neck heavier than any mop bucket. Clara didn't deserve to see him unravel, not like this. Across the city, Clara tied her apron and scanned the room automatically, eyes drifting toward the booth by the window. Empty. She waited, telling herself they were just late. But the morning rush came and went, and still no sign of Jack or Emma. She found herself glancing up at every chime of the door, hope rising, then falling with each new stranger. By the second day of their absence, restlessness crept into her bones. She told herself she was being ridiculous. Customers came and went. Families shifted routines. But this wasn't just a family. This was Jack. Emma, their laughter, their sketches, their fragile kind of hope. Clara realized she had grown used to them, to the way their presence lit a corner of the cafe that no one else could. Without them, the place felt emptier, as though the hum of the espresso machine had lost its rhythm. By the third day, worry gnawed at her. She found herself pacing during her break, replaying the way Jack had smiled, how carefully he counted change, how he never asked for more than the smallest cup of coffee. She knew struggle when she saw it, and she knew absence didn't always mean choice. It meant something had given way. Clara sat in the back room staring at her reflection in the steel of the fridge door. She had promised herself this experiment was about the business, about understanding customers at ground level. But the hollow ache in her chest told a different truth. She didn't just want to serve them coffee, she wanted to be part of their survival. She remembered the way Emma had called her a coffee angel, the way Jack's laughter had sounded the first time she teased him. They weren't just moments, they were threads, weaving her into their story whether she'd meant to or not. And now, with their absence pressing in on her, she felt the threads pull tight. Clara closed her eyes, her decision already made, though it frightened her. She couldn't stand behind the counter and wait for them to return. She couldn't pretend she was only an observer. For the first time in her carefully guarded life, she wanted to step forward, to reach past the safe walls of her inheritance and find them in the shadows of their struggle. She didn't know what she would say or how Jack would react, but she knew this much. She couldn't let him face the breaking point alone. The park was nearly empty that afternoon, the kind of gray day where the clouds pressed low and the air smelled faintly of rain. Jack sat on a worn bench with his shoulders hunched, hands clasped loosely between his knees. Emma was a few feet away on the grass, cross-legged with her sketchbook open, drawing trees that looked more like starbursts, her pencil moving fast as if the page might run away. Clara had been searching for them all morning, following some instinct she couldn't explain. When she spotted them, Jack heavy with silence, Emma humming under her breath, her chest tightened. She walked slowly, clutching the strap of her bag, rehearsing words she wasn't sure she had the courage to say. Jack noticed her first, his brow furrowing. He looked like a man caught between surprise and weariness. "You following me now?" he asked, his tone flat, though not unkind. Clara gave a small, tentative smile. "Not exactly." "Just worried when you didn't come by the cafe." Jack leaned back, eyes narrowing slightly. "We've been busy." The lie was thin, and they both knew it. Clara sat down anyway, close enough that their shoulders nearly brushed. For a moment she said nothing, just watched Emma sketch. Then, quietly, she began, "Jack, I know things aren't easy. And I know you'll probably hate me for saying this, but I can help." His head turned sharply, his jaw tightening. "Help? I could connect you with people," she said quickly. "Jobs, programs, even just a little money to get you through this month." Her voice trembled, urgency slipping through. "You don't have to carry all of this alone." Jack stiffened, his back rigid. His pride flared hot, a defense as natural as breath. "I don't need charity," he said, each word sharp enough to cut. Clara's throat tightened. She'd expected resistance, but hearing it out loud made her panic. The thought of retreating, of watching him disappear back into silence, was unbearable. Words tumbled out before she could stop them. "I'm not just a barista." The air between them shifted. Jack turned, confusion darkening his face. Clara's hands fumbled in her lap, twisting together as if she could wring courage from her fingers. "I didn't tell you because I wanted you to see me as just me. But it's true, my family owns the cafes, the whole chain. Winslow Coffee. I'm the heir." Jack blinked, his silence louder than any accusation. She rushed on, desperate to fill it. "I've been working behind the counter because my father wanted me to understand the business, to know what it's really like. But somewhere along the way, it stopped being about that. Her voice caught. I noticed you and Emma, and I couldn't just stand there watching you struggle, pretending I didn't care." Jack looked away, staring hard at the trees Emma had drawn. His breath came slow, deliberate, the way a man measures words he doesn't want to say. "So that's it," he muttered finally. "The angel routine. Muffins and cocoa, because you're really—" He shook his head. "A billionaire's daughter slumming it for fun." "It's not like that," Clara said quickly, her voice breaking on the edges. "I wasn't playing. I wasn't pretending with you." Jack's eyes cut back to hers, steel and fire mixed. "Do you know what it feels like to wonder if your kid will sleep under the same roof next month? Do you know what it costs a man to let his daughter see him beg? Because I do. And I can't let Emma think her father's worth is measured in how fast someone richer throws him a rope." Clara flinched, her chest aching at the bitterness in his words. But beneath it, she heard the fear, the love, the unbearable weight of a man who had been carrying too much for too long. Emma looked up then, waving her sketch toward them. "Daddy, look!" "I drew us in the park." Her voice was bright, oblivious to the tension threading through the air. Jack forced a smile, taking the page with gentle hands. Clara swallowed hard, her heart thudding. The truth was out, and nothing between them would ever be the same. She had wanted to offer salvation, but what she'd really given was a fracture, a glimpse of two worlds colliding, neither sure if they could survive the impact. The words left Clara's mouth before she had the chance to soften them, before she could reshape them into something less sharp, less final. "I'm not just a barista. I'm Clara Winslow." The name hovered in the air like a thunderclap, impossible to take back. Jack froze, his eyes narrowing as though he were replaying her voice to make sure he had heard correctly. He let out a low, disbelieving laugh, but there was nothing warm in it. "Winslow," he repeated, almost spitting it out. "As in Winslow Coffee, as in the name on every overpriced cup I can't afford to buy for my daughter?" Clara nodded, her chest tight, her hands gripping her knees as though they might anchor her. "Yes, but Jack, listen, I didn't want you to see me as—" "As what?" His voice cut her off, sharp and unsteady. "As the girl whose family charges me $5 for something that costs them 50 cents to make? As the heiress who plays dress-up behind the counter because she's bored?" His words landed like stones, heavy and bruising. Clara shook her head quickly, the panic rising in her throat. "No, it's not like that. I didn't lie to mock you. I just wanted—" "What? To feel real for a change?" Jack's jaw tightened, his knuckles white around the sketch Emma had just handed him. "You watched me count pennies on your counter. You watched me swallow my pride so my kid could have a cup of cocoa. And you said nothing. Do you have any idea what that feels like?" Clara's lips parted, but no sound came. The truth that she had been afraid, that she had wanted him to see her stripped of her name, just as a person, sounded so small now, so selfish against the weight of his fury. Emma blinked between them, confusion written across her small face. "Daddy?" she whispered, clutching her sketchbook to her chest. Jack stood abruptly, the bench scraping against the pavement of the park path. He took Emma's hand, his grip gentle but unyielding. "Come on, sweetheart. We're going home." Emma resisted just slightly, her gaze darting back to Clara. "But the coffee angel—" Jack's voice cracked. "She's not an angel, Em. She's someone else." Emma's lower lip trembled, but she followed, her small steps quick to match his longer stride. She kept looking over her shoulder until the path curved and Clara disappeared from view. Clara remained on the bench, the space beside her suddenly vast, her body trembling with a hollow ache. The sound of their footsteps fading away carved into her chest, each one a reminder of what she had just broken. She had thought honesty would set her free, would bring clarity to what was growing between them. Instead, it had felt like a betrayal delivered too late, an unveiling, that exposed only the distance between their worlds. She buried her face in her hands, her breath unsteady. Around her the park carried on, joggers passing, dogs barking, children chasing each other across the grass. Life moved as though nothing had happened, but Clara felt the weight of the silence Jack had left behind pressing harder than any boardroom, heavier than her father's lectures. She thought of Emma's wide eyes, the hurt confusion when Jack had pulled her away. That little girl had believed in angels, in kindness, in small miracles delivered in steaming cups, and now Clara feared she had shattered that belief. Her reflection in the cafe windows had always been split, heiress or barista, businesswoman or girl trying to find herself. But Jack had seen her as something else, something neither name could cover. And now she wondered if she had lost that chance forever. The bench felt colder as the minutes dragged, her heart echoing with the question she hadn't been brave enough to ask: was her honesty a gift too late, or a wound that would never close? The cafe was quieter than usual the next afternoon, the lull between the morning rush and the evening crowd. Clara stood behind the counter, wiping down the espresso machine for the third time, not because it needed cleaning, but because her hands needed something to do. Sleep had eluded her the night before. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Jack's face, stunned, angry, humiliated. The sound of his voice replayed like an accusation. You watched me count pennies. She hadn't been able to eat, hadn't been able to sit still. The memory clung to her like smoke. The bell above the door jingled, soft, almost hesitant. Clara glanced up, expecting another regular, but it wasn't. It was Emma. The little girl slipped inside quietly, her sketchbook hugged tight against her chest. She looked small against the tall glass door, her braids slightly crooked, her shoes scuffed. She shouldn't have been there alone, Clara thought, panic rising, until she realized Jack must not know. Clara set the cloth down, her breath catching. "Emma?" The girl didn't answer at first. She walked slowly toward the counter, her eyes wide but certain, like a child moving toward something she already understood. When she reached Clara, she opened her sketchbook and tore out a page with careful hands. She held it out, her voice barely above a whisper. "I made this for you." Clara took it gingerly, as though the paper might crumble. The drawing was simple, drawn in bold pencil strokes with uneven coloring, but it hit her harder than any masterpiece ever could. 3 figures sat at a cafe table, Emma in the middle, Jack on one side, Clara on the other. They were holding hands. Above them, a window glowed with stars and steam rising like music notes. "You made us feel seen," Emma whispered, as if confessing a secret too fragile to share out loud. Clara's throat tightened. She pressed a hand to her mouth, trying to stop the rush of tears that burned hot and unrelenting. All the nights she'd sat in boardrooms, all the years she'd been surrounded by people who knew her name but not her heart. And here was a child with crayons who had seen her fully, not as an heiress, not as a stranger behind a counter, but as someone who mattered. She crouched down to Emma's level, her voice breaking. "Why would you give this to me?" Emma looked down at her shoes, then back up with quiet bravery. "Because Daddy's mad, but I know. You're not bad. You helped." She bit her lip. "You're our coffee angel." Clara couldn't stop it anymore. She pulled Emma into her arms, hugging her tightly, her tears soaking into the child's braid. She hadn't realized how desperately she needed someone to believe in her, how hollow she had felt since Jack had walked away. And now here was Emma, small and fierce, offering her a grace she didn't deserve. "You're so much braver than me," Clara whispered into her hair. Emma squeezed back, strong for her size. "Daddy will remember." "He always does." Clara pulled away just enough to look into her eyes. "I don't know how to fix it," she admitted, "but I want to. More than anything." Emma nodded like she already understood. She slid her hand into Clara's, pressing the drawing deeper into her palm. "Keep it," she said softly. Clara held the paper to her chest, as though it were more precious than any contract, any inheritance, any fortune she had ever been promised. Emma believed in her even when Jack didn't. And that belief, so small, so pure, felt like the first true thing Clara had ever been given. She watched as Emma skipped back toward the door, her braid bouncing, her steps sure. Clara stood frozen, clutching the drawing with trembling fingers, her tears still wet. For the first time since her secret had shattered everything, she felt something new bloom inside her chest. Hope. The knock came just as Jack was finishing the dishes, the sound sharp against the quiet of the apartment. He frowned, drying his hands on a threadbare towel. He wasn't expecting anyone. No one ever came by without notice. Emma looked up from the floor where she was coloring, her eyes curious. Jack opened the door halfway, cautious. And there she was, Clara. No apron, no cafe chatter behind her. Just Clara standing in the dim hallway with something long and rectangular in her hands. For a moment, neither spoke. Her hair was loose, her cheeks flushed, her expression a careful mix of nerves and determination. "I shouldn't be here," she began, her voice soft but firm, "but I couldn't wait anymore." Jack stiffened, instinct telling him to close the door to protect the fragile balance he had left. "Clara, whatever this is—" She shifted the case into view, a guitar, the edges scuffed, the latch slightly dented, but intact. Jack's heart stopped. "I found it at a pawn shop," Clara said quickly, words tumbling out as though afraid he'd cut her off. "The one down on 7th. The owner said a man came in weeks ago, ready to sell, but walked out instead. I knew it had to be you." Jack's jaw tightened. His eyes dropped to the floor, shame rising like a tide. He wanted to push it away, to tell her she had no right, but his throat was too tight. Clara stepped closer, holding out the guitar like an offering. "I didn't bring money. I didn't bring connections, just this. Play again, Jack. Not for me, for her." Emma scrambled up from the floor, eyes wide. "Daddy, is that—" Jack closed his eyes, the weight of years pressing hard against his chest. His walls, built from pride and silence, trembled under Clara's words. He looked at Emma, her face glowing with hope, then back at Clara, whose gaze was steady despite the fear flickering underneath. Slowly, he reached for the case. His hands shook as he unlatched it, lifting the lid to reveal the guitar inside. The wood was scratched, the strings slightly tarnished. But it was his. It was memory and music, and pieces of himself he'd buried to survive. He sat down heavily on the couch, the instrument resting across his lap like an old friend he didn't know how to face. His fingers hovered above the strings, uncertain. Then, with a shaky breath, he pressed down and strummed a single chord. The sound filled the small apartment, imperfect but resonant, vibrating through the air like something alive. Jack's eyes burned. He blinked hard, but the tears came anyway, rolling hot down his cheeks. His voice caught in his throat, a laugh tangled with a sob. Emma clapped her hands, bouncing on her toes. "You played, Daddy!" "You played." Jack bowed his head, shoulders shaking, the guitar trembling against him. He hadn't realized how much he missed it, how much of himself had been silenced when he put it away. Clara watched from the doorway, her chest tight, her own eyes glistening. She hadn't known what would happen when she brought it here, only that she needed to try. And now, seeing him play even just one chord was like watching a crack of light burst through a long-closed door. Jack looked up at her finally, his voice raw. "Why would you do this?" Clara swallowed. "Because I can't stand by and watch you forget who you are." For a long moment they held each other's gaze. The walls he had built, the ones that had kept her out, felt thinner now. He didn't thank her, couldn't yet, but something in his eyes softened, a flicker of trust breaking through. Emma crawled onto the couch beside him, her small fingers plucking at the strings. Jack smiled through his tears, guiding her hand gently. Another chord rang out, clumsy but full of joy. Something shifted in the room, quiet but undeniable. It wasn't salvation, not yet. But it was a beginning, one chord, one laugh, one fragile promise that maybe, just maybe, music could bring them back to life. The cafe glowed differently that night. Strings of warm lights hung from the ceiling, softening the edges of the familiar space. Tables were pushed aside to make room for folding chairs, the smell of fresh pastries mingling with the hum of anticipation. Clara stood near the entrance, her heart thudding, as people filtered in. Neighbors from down the block, students with sketchbooks, families carrying laughter in with them. She had planned every detail quietly, slipping it past the board, past her father, past anyone who might try to turn it into a press release. Tonight wasn't about business. Tonight was about them. Emma sat proudly near the front, her drawings propped up along a makeshift display wall. She had arranged them herself. Cups of cocoa with steam curling like music, stars scattered across cafe windows, her father with a guitar slung across his shoulder. She darted between the easels, guiding visitors from one picture to the next, her voice bubbling with excitement. Every time someone stopped to compliment her, she glanced toward her father, her grin growing wider. Jack stood in the corner, guitar in hand, adjusting the tuning pegs with careful fingers. He looked out of place at first, his work boots scuffed, his shirt worn soft from too many washes. But when he strummed a few notes to test the strings, the room shifted. People hushed, leaning in, sensing the weight in the way he held the instrument, not as a prop, but as a lifeline rediscovered. Clara lingered by his side, resisting the old instinct to retreat behind the counter. She wasn't staff tonight, not the heiress hiding in plain sight. She was just Clara, standing where she wanted to stand, beside them. Jack glanced at her once, his brow furrowed, as though still surprised she hadn't stepped back into her safe world. But she stayed, her hand brushing the edge of his chair, steady and certain. When the time came, Jack cleared his throat and sat on the small stool at the front. The cafe had never been so quiet. He adjusted the strap on his shoulder, fingers trembling slightly. "I'm not much for speeches," he began, his voice low but carrying. "I used to think music was something I left behind, something I had no right to anymore. But someone—" His eyes flicked toward Clara just for a moment, reminded me that maybe it was still part of me. So tonight, I'm just going to play, not for applause, for her. He nodded toward Emma, whose eyes sparkled brighter than the lights strung above. The first chord rang out, rich and steady. The room seemed to exhale as the melody unfolded, simple, heartfelt, full of pauses that carried as much meaning as the notes themselves. It wasn't polished, it wasn't perfect, but it was real, and the people listening felt it. Emma sat cross-legged near the stage, clapping softly along with the rhythm, her drawings fluttering behind her like witnesses to the moment. Clara closed her eyes briefly, the music washing through her, undoing knots she hadn't even realized she carried. When the final note lingered and faded, the cafe erupted in applause. Not polite, not distant, fierce, grateful, alive. Jack bowed his head slightly, the corners of his mouth lifting in a smile so rare it startled even him. Emma threw her arms around him, her laughter ringing louder than the claps. Clara stepped closer, her voice just above a whisper, meant only for him. "See? This isn't charity. This is choice. Mine, yours." Jack looked at her, the weight in his gaze softening into something else, acceptance, maybe even belonging. He shook his head gently, almost in disbelief. "I kept thinking you were here to save us," he murmured. "But you're not. You're just here." Clara's lips curved, her throat tightening. "That's enough?" He glanced at Emma, then back at Clara. "More than enough." The crowd drifted into chatter again, neighbors mingling, Emma holding court over her drawings, music still echoing faintly in the rafters. Jack set the guitar down and took a step closer to Clara. For the first time, the air between them felt settled, not like two worlds colliding, but like one world forming, the heiress and the janitor, the barista and the father, the girl with stars in her sketchbook, All of them had been brought together by something as simple as a cup of cocoa. And in that little cafe, beneath the glow of string lights and the hum of voices, they discovered what neither wealth nor survival had ever given them. Not fortune, not fame, just love that stayed. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to share it with someone who could use a reminder that kindness still changes lives. And don't forget to subscribe, because the next story might be the one that speaks straight to your soul.